Under the low-hanging sky of a southern suburb, the hum of sprinklers and the mechanical rhythm of golf carts formed the background noise to what was supposed to be a new beginning. Riley Cole, a 62-year-old retired machinery technician with a quiet demeanor and the hardened hands of a man who'd spent most of his life fixing what others gave up on, had only recently moved into this community with his 13-year-old daughter, Jade. She was born with muscular dystrophy, and for Riley, every decision, down to the angle of the driveway and the width of the front steps, was made with her condition in mind. Their move was part of a quiet compromise, a better environment for Jade's therapy and a final chapter of peace for Riley after the death of his wife 2 years earlier. Their house was modest, nothing extravagant, but it was accessible. It was safe, and it was theirs. The neighborhood, built around order and trimmed hedges, was polite in a way that often felt sterile. No one came to welcome them. No pies, no handshakes. Just a sea of glances from behind sheer curtains and a notable tension when Riley pulled up in his full-size modified van. The van was not pretty, but it worked. It had a mechanical lift, reinforced locks, and a custom interior that made it possible for Jade to feel like she wasn't just being transported, but moving through life with a bit more dignity. The first time they rolled out the ramp, a man watering his lawn across the street stared so intently that Jade asked Riley if something was wrong with her face. Riley had smiled, brushing her hair aside gently. "Nothing at all, sweetheart. Some people just aren't used to courage." But there was one neighbor who didn't bother hiding her discomfort behind a window. Karen Bliss, from the corner house with the biggest lawn and the loudest outdoor speakers, introduced herself in a way Riley would never forget. She didn't come over to say hello. She stood at the edge of her property line with her arms crossed, chin lifted slightly like a school principal dealing with a tardy student, and waited until Riley noticed her. When he did, she offered a tight smile and pointed to the patch of sidewalk where his van had momentarily idled while he adjusted the rear door. "That's city concrete," she said, her voice sharpened by faux sweetness. "We try to avoid blocking it." Riley, caught off guard but not surprised, simply nodded. "I was just getting the ramp down for my daughter. We won't be long." Karen leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping half a register. "Yes, I saw. But you know how these things start. One day it's 5 minutes, then 10. Then, next thing you know, the whole street's a parking lot." Riley didn't answer. He didn't need to. Karen's words were not a warning. They were a test. Her home was strategically placed. Her front windows faced 3 driveways, and she spent most afternoons riding up and down the block in her pale blue golf cart like a cruise ship captain patrolling her deck. She was well fed, with the kind of forced cheeriness that made people think twice about saying what they actually thought of her. Her yard was always spotless, her roses aligned with obsessive precision. She wore workout clothes religiously, despite rarely walking more than 10 feet from her cart. The next time Riley brought Jade to her weekly physical therapy session, he made sure to park with even more care, tucking the van's nose inward and checking every inch for proximity violations. As he was locking up, he noticed a sign that hadn't been there the day before. A small metal post hammered neatly into the grass near the sidewalk with the words, "Golf Cart Access Only," printed on a reflective background. It wasn't official. There was no municipal stamp or enforcement code. But it was mounted firmly, with all the deliberation of someone making a point. Riley didn't say anything to Jade, but he made a mental note. The kind you don't write down. The kind that stays. Karen began to escalate in subtle ways, always just below the threshold of formal complaint. One morning, as Riley was helping Jade navigate the incline of their driveway, she rolled past slowly in her cart, glanced sideways and said, "Still working on the coordination, huh?" Then giggled to herself as if she were joking. Jade went quiet the rest of the day. Another time, she stopped Riley outside his garage and asked with mock innocence whether he'd considered using the rear alley for access since, Some of the older residents get overwhelmed by larger vehicles. Riley, maintaining the calm exterior he had worn like armor for decades, replied only with a question of his own. You worried they'll be overwhelmed by wheelchairs too? Karen didn't respond. She just pursed her lips, turned the cart around, and drove off. It wasn't that Riley was unused to conflict. Years in industrial repair had taught him how to stay level while customers screamed or deadlines collapsed. He knew when to keep his mouth shut and when to speak up. But this was different. This was slow erosion. It wasn't the words. It was the way Jade started asking to skip outings. It was how she lingered in the hallway instead of rolling outside to read like she used to. It was watching her stare at the wheels of her own chair instead of the trees. Riley had fought 1,000 fights in his life. This one, quiet, personal, insidious, was the one that felt like a noose tightening. Then came the morning that changed everything. It was a Friday, warm, still, uneventful until Riley opened the door to load Jade for her therapy session. Her appointment had been moved earlier due to a scheduling issue, and he'd prepped everything the night before. The lift was working perfectly, the route clear. But as he stepped outside, he saw it. Karen's golf cart, parked at an angle, its front bumper neatly blocking the downward slope of their driveway. It wasn't an accident. The battery cable was disconnected and sitting visibly atop the rear axle, as if someone had gone out of their way to fake a malfunction. A single laminated card hung from the windshield. Do not tow. Municipal permit pending. Riley stood there for a long time, hands at his sides. Jade wheeled out behind him, stopped short when she saw the blockage, and quietly said, "Is that her cart?" Riley didn't answer immediately. His mind had already jumped 6 steps ahead. He checked his watch. They had 30 minutes before they'd be late. The van couldn't turn sharply enough to reverse out without a risk of scraping the ramp. The sidewalk exit was too steep for Jade's chair without the van's lift platform. He looked down the street. No sign of Karen. No other neighbors outside. Just them. And that cart. He called the city towing service. The wait time was 2 hours. He considered asking a neighbor for help, but he already knew how that would go. He turned back to the garage, walked inside and opened the second storage cabinet, the one he hadn't used in years. Behind the paint cans and deflated basketballs was a thick coil of industrial towing chain he used to drag engine blocks across shop floors. It had never failed him. Jade looked confused when he returned with it slung over his shoulder. "Dad, what are you doing?" Riley gave her a tired smile. "Something I should have done the first time she pulled this kind of stunt." He locked the chain around the front axle of the golf cart, cinched it twice, and fed the other end into the hitch socket of the van. The noise of metal scraping on asphalt echoed up and down the cul-de-sac. The cart's rear tires lifted clean off the pavement as the van began to pull forward, carving a slow arc toward the edge of the communal greenbelt. Karen's carefully detailed cart jolted and bounced like a rag doll. Riley didn't speed up. He didn't yell. He didn't even look around to see if anyone was watching. At the edge of the wooded trail where the grass turned to dirt, he pulled the van into a wide loop, reversed up a hill, and backed the cart under an old oak tree with sprawling branches. With practiced motion, he unhooked the chain from the hitch, climbed the tree part way, looped the chain over a low limb, and, with a grunt of effort, used a manual crank to lift the cart off the ground just enough that its tires spun idly, uselessly. He didn't say a word when he was done. He didn't leave a note. He didn't call anyone. He just returned to the house, reloaded the ramp, and helped Jade into the van. By the time they pulled away, the cart was still spinning softly in the breeze, like a warning bell that no one could pretend not to hear. The incident with the golf cart hanging like a bizarre ornament from the limb of a dying oak marked a shift in how the neighborhood responded to Riley and Jade. For about 48 hours, there was silence. Not the usual polite suburban silence, but something more deliberate, like a held breath. The cart remained suspended through the weekend, swaying faintly with each gust of wind. On Sunday morning, while Riley trimmed the hedges, he noticed a pair of teenagers walking their golden retriever stop, look up at the dangling cart, whisper something to each other, and then keep walking at a noticeably faster pace. No one came to confront him. No one knocked on the door or called the police that day. But by Monday morning, the peace cracked like old paint. Karen returned. She didn't storm down the street or create a scene in public. She came back like a storm cloud rolling in sideways, quiet, heavy, and unrelenting. Around 8 a.m., Riley saw her golf cart had been retrieved. It was sitting in her driveway, rear hatch open, a tarp covering most of it. Her movements were stiff and theatrical. From across the road, Riley could see she was limping slightly, although there was no sign of a cast or brace. She was on the phone for much of the morning, pacing back and forth in her driveway. Occasionally, she'd glance toward Riley's house and mutter something with a little too much animation for a casual conversation. Later that afternoon, a police cruiser showed up. Not lights and sirens, but slowly, like a courtesy visit. An officer stepped out, spoke to Karen for nearly 15 minutes, then walked over to Riley's side of the street. He introduced himself respectfully. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were alert. He wasn't here for a confrontation, just clarity. Riley offered him water, shook his hand, and explained everything. The officer, to his credit, didn't raise an eyebrow when Riley said the words, "towed it with chains." He asked about damage. Riley said he was careful. Nothing was broken that wasn't already bent by Karen's own stubbornness. The officer took a few notes and admitted that, technically, since the cart had been parked without permission on a private drive, Riley hadn't committed any prosecutable offense. Karen, however, was filing a complaint of harassment and emotional intimidation, something vague and not likely to go anywhere without proof. The officer's advice was simple. Keep a log. If she escalates again, report it. Don't take matters into your own hands next time. Riley agreed, though he had no intention of letting anyone obstruct his daughter's mobility ever again. Karen wasn't finished. On Tuesday, Riley received a bright orange flyer taped to his front door, typed, printed on heavy cardstock, and worded like a city citation, though it bore no official insignia. It claimed that unauthorized vehicular manipulation and public disturbance had been observed, and that non-conforming behavior would be reviewed by the local Standards Council. There was no phone number, no return address, just a suggestion at the bottom. Attend the upcoming community meeting to clarify your status. It was nonsense, obviously. Riley wasn't part of any local council, and no such authority existed to his knowledge. Still, it wasn't meaningless. It was a psychological jab, carefully designed to look like bureaucracy, just enough ambiguity to unnerve someone unfamiliar with red tape. Jade noticed it before he took it down. She didn't say anything, but that evening during dinner, she quietly asked, "Is she trying to scare us?" Riley didn't answer right away. He took a bite of dry roast chicken and chewed until his jaw hurt. "She wants us to feel like we don't belong," he finally said. "Like we're intruding on something. But we're not. This is our home." That night, he installed a motion sensor on the front steps and moved the van slightly back into the garage, just enough to make the ramp more discreet. The following morning, he found a cracked eggshell at the base of the mailbox. Just one, cleanly split, yolk missing. Not shattered, placed. It wasn't dramatic, but it felt too intentional to ignore. Riley added it to the logbook he'd started after the officer's visit, listing the time, date, and conditions. On Thursday, things escalated further. A woman named Sandra, who lived 3 houses down and had barely said a word to Riley since he moved in, stopped him while he was unloading groceries and handed him a sealed manila envelope. "I was asked to pass this to you," she said with an apologetic shrug. "I didn't open it. I don't want to be involved." Inside was a printed letter, unsigned with the heading Neighborhood Preservation Committee, in bold serif font. The body of the letter referenced ongoing concerns about the suitability of industrial vehicles in pedestrian priority environments, and accused Riley of deliberate provocations that jeopardize the harmony of our residential dynamic. It concluded with a paragraph urging Riley to reconsider the tone and scale of your continued presence. Beneath it, stapled, was a printout of his property from Google Street View, with the van circled in red ink. Riley scanned it once, twice, then folded it and slid it into a file folder labeled Nonsense. He didn't curse, he didn't storm out, but the skin around his eyes tightened just slightly, the way it did whenever a machine refused to start on the first try. He wasn't angry, not yet. He was preparing. The next day, a small package arrived. No return address, but it came through official postal channels. Inside was a miniature wheelchair, a toy model, plastic, cheap, painted bright pink. On the seat, a piece of paper folded into quarters. Maybe scale it down next time. Riley didn't show it to Jade. He sat on the back porch that evening, staring at the toy in his palm. The sun was setting behind the tree line, turning the sky orange and sickly gold. It wasn't the object that disturbed him. It was the calculation. Someone had taken the time to order, pack, and ship a message, knowing it would be opened by a father, not a daughter. It wasn't about disability. It was about control. By now, Riley had already set up a meeting with an attorney, not because he wanted to sue anyone, but because he wanted the paper trail to start in more than his own handwriting. He brought printouts, photographs, the toy, even the cracked eggshell. The attorney, a young woman with a precise tone and an expression that didn't reveal judgment, listened carefully. She nodded a lot, asked a few questions, then offered this. There's nothing illegal yet, but it's coordinated. Document everything. And if anything comes with a signature, we move. The following week, things turned practical. The garbage bins were skipped on collection day, just his. He called sanitation. They claimed no knowledge of any service change. One night, someone scattered fertilizer over his lawn in an irregular pattern, burning the grass into a brown symbol that looked vaguely like a dollar sign, or perhaps a broken peace symbol. Jade noticed it first from her window. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just turned away and went back to her book. But the breaking point wasn't a letter or a prank. It was Tuesday morning, 1 week after the toy wheelchair, when Riley tried to start the van. And it didn't respond. The dashboard flickered, but the ignition refused to catch. After 15 minutes of troubleshooting, he opened the hood and found the battery cable had been cut clean through. Not chewed, not frayed. Cut with precision, like someone had used a blade and knew exactly where to slice. He didn't call the police. He didn't call the attorney. He didn't even fix it right away. He walked across the street to Karen's house, knocked once, then again, until she opened the door, feigning surprise in her housecoat and curlers. "I want this to stop," Riley said. Karen tilted her head. "Excuse me. I know you don't like me. I know you don't like my daughter. But if anything else happens, one more letter, one more anonymous threat, I'm taking it straight to the county board. And you know what they do to people who manufacture neighborhood disputes." Karen's smile didn't falter, but her eyes twitched just slightly. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Cole." Riley didn't respond. He just turned and walked away. Later that evening, the motion sensor on the porch tripped. Riley stepped outside in time to see a dark figure dart between the hedges and disappear behind a parked car. He didn't give chase. He didn't yell. He just opened the garage, pulled out a length of steel chain, and laid it gently across the driveway like a borderline drawn in gravel and dust. Not a trap, just a reminder. This wasn't over. But it had changed. Now there were no more misunderstandings. Now everything was intentional. It was one thing to endure hostility in silence, to bear the weight of subtle sabotage and pretend that what you were facing was nothing more than neighborly friction. But when lines are crossed, not in metaphor but in steel and wire, in silence and trespass, silence is no longer an option. The morning after Riley found the severed battery cable, he didn't speak to Jade about it. She had enough to carry, and Riley didn't want her growing up learning to flinch at shadows. Instead, he drove to the hardware store, replaced the cable himself, and spent the rest of the day upgrading the van's hood latch with a locking mechanism more suited to industrial equipment than a suburban vehicle. The next morning, he installed a small dashboard camera inside the van, one that ran on a backup battery and started recording whenever there was movement outside. There was no announcement, no confrontation. Riley's methods weren't about warning. They were about preparation. But as with all things in war, escalation rarely comes from one side alone. That Thursday, as Riley returned from a grocery run, he found Jade sitting stiffly on the porch, her expression blank, her hands resting flat on her thighs. When he asked what was wrong, she said nothing at first, just handed him a piece of mail that had been shoved, not into the box but under the mat, a flyer advertising a Community Beautification Workshop. The image was a poorly edited photo of their house with red arrows pointing at the van, the ramp, and the wheelchair lift. The caption beneath read, "Before Improvements." Riley read it twice, jaw tight, the silence between them stretching like a taut wire. Jade didn't cry. She didn't ask questions. But when she finally spoke, her voice was thin. "Is it me they hate? Or you?" Riley looked at her, stunned into stillness. The question was too sharp, too direct for a child her age. But Jade had always been perceptive, always noticed things before most kids did. He swallowed hard and shook his head. "They don't hate us," he said, though he knew it was only partially true. "They're just scared of anything that doesn't fit their idea of normal. That's not our fault, and it doesn't mean we disappear." That night, he called the lawyer again. This time, he asked her to begin assembling a formal complaint, not against Karen directly, but against whoever was responsible for the anonymous mailings, property damage, and coordinated harassment. The lawyer advised caution. No direct accusations without proof. But she agreed to draft a letter, a preliminary warning, and send it to every homeowner on the street. Not aggressive, but assertive. The kind of letter that didn't shout lawsuit, but whispered, "We're watching now." The letter went out on Monday. On Wednesday morning, a rock smashed through Riley's side window. It happened just before dawn. Riley was in the kitchen brewing coffee when he heard the thud of glass, the sharp percussion of impact. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his phone, turned on the exterior floodlights, and stepped outside. The window was shattered inward, the edges sparkling like frost. A large river stone lay on the kitchen floor, wrapped in a paper towel. There were no words written on it, no threats, no messages, just the weight of it, dense and unmistakable. The act needed no explanation. Jade was still asleep and Riley cleaned the mess before she woke, but the adrenaline stayed in his blood. He wasn't scared, not exactly, but he was alert in a way he hadn't been since the day his wife died, and the whole world had tilted sideways beneath his feet. He made a second pot of coffee, opened the file marked Incidents, and began writing. This time, he added sketches. Where the rock had landed, where the paper towel had absorbed blood from his finger when he picked it up too fast. Details mattered. They always had. But the worst wasn't the window. It was what came after. By the weekend, the neighborhood was humming with quiet gossip. Riley began to notice that when he passed other houses, conversations died mid-sentence. Lawn chairs were angled away from his direction. Kids playing in driveways were called inside with sudden urgency. It was like he had become radioactive. Not out of fear, out of convenience. His presence demanded discomfort, and people hated being reminded that comfort was a fragile thing. They didn't want to know about the girl in the wheelchair or the man who wouldn't just take the hint and move away. They wanted quiet mornings, trimmed lawns, and someone else to blame when their peace was disrupted. And then came the dog. Karen had a Cocker Spaniel. Overfed, undertrained, and perpetually wearing a pink bow like it had wandered off a reality show. It had barked before, sure, but now it became relentless. Every time Jade rolled down the ramp, the dog would start shrieking from across the street. It didn't sound like normal barking. It sounded like an alarm, a high-pitched, repetitive shriek that frayed the nerves and made even the squirrels stop in confusion. Riley filed a complaint. Nothing happened. He began recording the incidents, logging times, dates, durations. Still, no response. But then, on a Wednesday evening, as Riley took out the trash, he found the dog loose in his yard. It had dug into the edge of the flower bed, uprooting 2 of Jade's recently planted herbs and shredding the mulch. When Riley approached, it growled, then pissed on the ramp. He didn't touch it. He didn't even yell. He just stood there, looking at the mess, then pulled out his phone and started taking pictures. The next morning, a note was taped to his door. Animals know evil when they see it. That was the moment something in him snapped. He didn't retaliate physically. He didn't throw the note back or yell across the street. He did something far more dangerous. He began to plan. He called the lawyer again and authorized the preparation of a cease and desist order. He asked for a list of regulatory violations related to noise, harassment, and unauthorized mail campaigns. He filed a second police report, this time citing escalation. And then, quietly, methodically, he built a dossier, not just on Karen, but on the entire pattern of behavior from the moment they'd arrived. He started waking up earlier, watching who came and went, who parked where, who walked with whom. He didn't become obsessed, he became strategic. Meanwhile, Karen escalated in her own way. She hosted a neighborhood wellness circle in her front yard, complete with folding chairs, pitchers of lemon water, and laminated handouts titled, "Protecting Our Values." Riley was not invited. The sound system, however, was turned high enough that he could hear every word through his open window. Phrases like preserving aesthetic cohesion and minimizing disruptive elements floated through the air like coded bullets. Jade, trying to do homework at the kitchen table, asked if they should move again. Riley didn't answer. He couldn't. There was too much acid in his throat. 2 days later, someone began leaving candles on their sidewalk. Tea lights in glass jars, spaced evenly, each night around dusk. At first, it seemed random. Then Riley noticed a pattern. 13 candles, 1 for each year of Jade's life. No card, no signature, just presence. Presence where none had been invited. And still, somehow, it got worse. A delivery arrived on a Friday morning. A pallet of landscaping gravel dumped directly in front of his driveway. The truck driver handed Riley a form and said, "Paid in cash. Delivery address matches." Riley refused it, but by the time the company returned to pick it up, the damage was done. He couldn't access the ramp. Jade's appointment was missed. When Riley tried to explain to the receptionist over the phone why they couldn't make it, he could hear the disbelief in her voice. People always assume it's exaggeration until it happens to them. That night, Riley didn't sleep. He sat in the garage, polishing his tools, checking the integrity of the new lock on the van's hood, recalibrating the dashboard camera, making a checklist of what still needed reinforcement. He wasn't afraid, not for himself, but Jade deserved to live in a place where the ground didn't shift under her wheels every time she left the house. He opened a blank sheet of paper and began writing. Not a complaint, not a threat. A statement, a record, Something that could be read in a courtroom or a county board meeting. Something that couldn't be ignored or misrepresented. Every action, every time, every witness he could name. And then, for the first time in months, he stepped outside without looking over his shoulder. He walked across the yard, across the street, and placed a copy of the letter inside Karen's unlocked mailbox. No threat, no message, just truth. Then he turned around and went home. By now, the neighbors had begun to realize that Riley wasn't going to disappear. He wasn't going to explode or retaliate like they expected. He wasn't the character in their play. He was the author now, and the ending would be his to write. By the end of that month, the air in the neighborhood had changed. It wasn't open hostility anymore. It was something more strained and theatrical, like everyone was holding their breath, unsure whether they were watching the final act of a slow-burning tragedy or the beginning of something far worse. Riley had become the quiet center of gravity for the entire block, not because he demanded attention, but because everyone could feel that he wasn't done. He moved differently now, not with anger, but with purpose. He trimmed his lawn at dusk, installed a solar-powered perimeter light along the sidewalk, and reinforced the van's external wiring with metal conduit. Every action was deliberate, methodical, and done without ceremony. He was no longer just a man defending his daughter. He had become an operator. Jade, meanwhile, had learned to mask the tension in her body with practiced restraint. She didn't ask questions when she saw new devices appear on the windowsills or when Riley changed the locks a second time. But her eyes lingered too long on the window during their routine mornings, and her movements grew more hesitant when the weather was good, when they were expected to be outside. The trauma was becoming ambient, like a frequency only they could hear, and Riley could feel the cost it was extracting from her spirit. It was in this tense and surreal lull that the invitation arrived. It wasn't a direct message, but a suggestion passed through a neighbor in a brown windbreaker, Tom from 3 doors down, someone who had once shared a six-pack with Riley after a power outage killed the entire block's air conditioning. Tom approached Riley while he was pressure washing the pavement, keeping his voice low, glancing over his shoulder before speaking. "There's gonna be a gathering," he said without preamble. "Next Friday, back lawn of the church. They're calling it a neighborhood alignment meeting." Riley stopped mid-spray and looked at him. "Alignment?" Tom shrugged. "That's the word they're using. Karen's behind it. It's not official, but it's serious. I figured you should know. You won't get a flyer." Riley nodded once. "Thanks." He didn't ask for more. He didn't need to. The message was clear. The neighborhood, or at least its more organized faction, was preparing to draw a line. Not just metaphorically, but publicly. The following Friday, Riley didn't attend. Instead, he sent his lawyer in his place, not in person but through a formal letter, professionally printed and enclosed in a navy blue folder. The letter opened by outlining the events of the past 2 months, documented, timed, witnessed. It described the harassment, the property damage, the implied threats, and the deeply personal violations of dignity and access. But it did not accuse. It posed a question. "What kind of neighborhood do you want this to be?" Karen never responded directly. But the fallout was almost immediate. 3 days later, Riley received an anonymous packet of information in his mailbox. No return address, no note. Inside were photocopies of emails between several neighbors, including Karen, discussing Riley and Jade by name. Some of the exchanges were petty, focusing on optics and maintaining consistency, but others were pointed. One suggested getting city enforcement involved. Another recommended increased visibility tactics to put soft pressure. There was even a mock-up of a petition to have large vehicles banned from the cul-de-sac entirely. It had been partially signed. Riley scanned each page, made duplicates, then brought the originals to his lawyer the next morning. "This is enough to move forward," she said, her voice clipped with focus. "If you want to go public, I can reach out to advocacy networks. If you want to push for civil harassment charges, we can start drafting affidavits." Riley stared out the window for a moment, watching a crow pick apart something on the sidewalk. "Not yet," he said. "Let them keep digging." That night, something shifted in the rhythm of the neighborhood. Cars that used to be parked neatly in driveways began blocking the sidewalk more frequently, as if in some unspoken protest. The family across the street moved their grill to the front yard and started hosting evening cookouts with music just loud enough to drown out conversation. When Jade tried to wheel herself along the sidewalk for fresh air, she found it lined with trash cans pulled farther out than usual, creating a gauntlet of narrowed passages. Nothing illegal, nothing direct, just enough friction to make her feel boxed in. But Riley's patience was not unlimited. On the third night of blocked access, he returned the favor, not with trash cans or passive aggression, but with clarity. He parked the van horizontally across his own driveway, locked the ramp in the down position, and left it there, fully extended, like a defiant drawbridge. No one said a word, but by morning the cans were back in place. The real turning point came 1 week later. Jade had a morning appointment for a full mobility assessment, an important milestone that Riley had carefully coordinated with her care team. As they prepared to leave, Riley noticed something strange. The van's left rear tire looked lower than usual. A quick inspection revealed the valve had been tampered with, a clean slice through the rubber cap, the air slowly leaking. He patched it fast, but they were late, and by the time they arrived, the center's intake manager informed them that the therapist had already moved on to another patient. Riley apologized, holding Jade's hand as she tried not to let her disappointment show. But that night, he did something he had never done before. He made a phone call to a contact from his previous life. Not a friend, not someone from the neighborhood, but a man named Victor, a private consultant Riley had once worked with during a contract job evaluating mechanical failure rates in municipal vehicles. Victor wasn't a lawyer or a technician. He was a pattern analyst, a quiet operator who could look at the big picture without emotion. "I'm not asking you to intervene," Riley said. "I just want you to take a look at this. Tell me if I'm wrong." Victor agreed. Riley emailed over the dossier. 2 days later, Victor called back. "You're not wrong," he said. "You're being pressure boxed. Classic soft target attrition. The goal isn't to get you to react. It's to make you exhaust yourself. Legally, you're being danced right to the edge. It's coordinated but sloppy. They're not professionals." "What's the end game?" Riley asked. "They're waiting for you to make a mistake. Snap, yell, shove someone. Then you're the aggressor. And the moment they get that moment on record, it becomes the story." Riley thanked him and hung up. That night he cooked dinner slowly, carefully, refusing to let his hands tremble. He helped Jade with her math homework, then sat on the porch and watched the sun go down with the stillness that masked the fire underneath. He now understood what he had refused to name. This wasn't a feud. This was strategic exile, and the time for endurance had passed. The silence that followed Victor's analysis wasn't empty. It was tactical. Riley took 2 days to sit with what he now understood fully. This wasn't neighborhood friction or misunderstanding. It was attrition by inconvenience, a methodical war of psychological erosion. They weren't trying to remove him overnight. They were grinding him down hour by hour, betting that a single father with a disabled child and no appetite for performance would eventually fold. What they hadn't accounted for, however, was that Riley had already lived through a loss more absolute than any war of pressure. After losing his wife, there was no social suffocation that could match the blunt silence of waking up next to absence every morning. And so, rather than retaliate, he did what no one expected. He reset. He rearranged his schedule to minimize visibility. He had groceries delivered and installed a second refrigerator in the garage. He changed their walking routes to avoid the clusters of noise and cars that had formed around the neighborhood's soft choke points. He rerouted the van through a fire road behind the houses, one he hadn't used since they first moved in, and reinforced it with gravel, reflective tape, and motion-activated lights. The map of their daily existence shifted, shrank, and took on the efficiency of an operator moving behind enemy lines. At the same time, Riley's lawyer began quietly assembling a file. A real one now, intended not for court, but for escalation to the county's Civil Enforcement Division. They couldn't target a neighbor for being unpleasant, but they could cite patterns. The emails, the dog incidents, the gravel drop, the tire puncture, all pointed to a neighborhood in breach of safe housing codes. Riley didn't need to win a war, he just needed to force it into light. He didn't want a courtroom drama. He wanted a paper trail no one could erase. But of course, when predators sense they're being watched, they change tactics. It started with a friendly voice message on Riley's answering machine from a woman he didn't know, Leanne, from the so-called Neighborhood Liaison Group. She claimed she was hoping to find a way to ease the climate on the block, her tone sickeningly pleasant. She mentioned the potential for a facilitated dialogue and restoring neighborly cohesion. Riley didn't respond. He filed the audio under Containment Theater. Then came the package, another anonymous delivery, no return address. Inside, a book, Taming the Tyrant Within. On the title page, someone had handwritten in red ink, "Sometimes, peace is a choice." This time, Riley showed it to Jade. She looked at the page, then up at him. "They think you're the problem," she asked. Riley nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Jade didn't speak again that evening. By the following weekend, the neighborhood was on edge. The social architecture had shifted, and the attempt at psychological siege wasn't working. Karen, Riley suspected, had expected him to lash out or withdraw, but he was doing neither. He was preparing, and that made him dangerous in a way she couldn't control. So she returned to what she did best: public manipulation. On Saturday afternoon, Karen organized a community cleanup, complete with teenagers in matching vests and rented equipment parked along the sidewalk. It looked legitimate: bright banners, matching gloves, even bottled water on tables. Riley, who'd seen enough front operations to know a cover when he saw one, watched from his garage. He noticed that the equipment never moved beyond his property. The cleanup zone was his sidewalk, his mailbox, his curbside trees. Two teenagers with rakes and trash grabbers stood awkwardly near his ramp. One of them muttered something and kicked at the base of the mailbox. Riley didn't stop them. He turned on the garage camera, adjusted the angle, and returned to organizing his tool bench. An hour later, he received a text from a city number he didn't recognize. Automated, no signature. It said, "Your curb has been cited for non-compliant vegetation. Fine pending review." He forwarded it to his lawyer. The next day, a different form of pressure arrived. A woman with a clipboard knocked on his door. She was young, dressed like she worked in a yoga studio with a smile too wide and a script too polished. She introduced herself as part of the Neighborhood Access Safety Initiative and began listing off concerns about the accessibility of the cul-de-sac, particularly regarding the presence of unusual vehicular activity. Riley asked for her credentials. She offered a laminated badge with no seal, just the logo of a consulting firm he'd never heard of. He invited her to wait, then stepped inside, called his lawyer, and returned 10 minutes later with a printed cease and desist letter signed and notarized the day before. He handed it to her without a word. She didn't protest. She folded it, put it in her satchel, and left. But the message was clear. They were no longer hiding. They had normalized the siege, and now they were moving to Phase 2, fabrication. The following morning, the real escalation hit. It began with a siren. Not close, but audible. Riley stepped outside and saw a fire truck crawling through the block. It stopped halfway up the street and idled there. A few minutes later, a fireman approached him, asked if he had called in a report of a chemical smell. Riley shook his head. The fireman nodded, made a note, and left without explanation. 2 hours later, the sheriff's department knocked. Someone had called in a report of loud yelling at Riley's address. Jade had been at school. Riley had been reading a manual. It happened again the next day. This time, someone called in a concern about the van blocking a hydrant. There was no hydrant. When Riley pointed this out, the responding officer offered a half apology, told him his address had been flagged, and advised that cooperation would prevent further inconvenience. Riley called his attorney. She was already drafting the declaration to the county. But it wasn't fast enough. On Thursday evening, Riley was walking back from the shed when he noticed the drone. It hovered silently at the edge of his backyard, just high enough to avoid noise detection, with a blinking green light pulsing like a heartbeat. It stayed there for nearly a full minute before drifting upward and vanishing over the rooftops. Riley wasn't surprised. He'd seen this tactic used in surveillance work. Not for information, just intimidation, a reminder that visibility was no longer his to control. He installed an anti-drone jammer the next morning. Silent, legal, invisible, and effective. By Friday, the campaign against him hit its apex. He received a formal complaint, not from Karen, not from the city, but from a newly formed neighborhood committee claiming that he was creating a hostile urban visual presence. The letter cited the unlicensed modifications to vehicular architecture and referenced the lift on the van as a structural imbalance to pedestrian aesthetic. It was signed by 6 people. One of them was Tom, the man who had once warned him in good faith. Riley didn't call Tom. He didn't even get angry. He understood now that people like Tom didn't pick sides because they had principles. They picked them because they didn't want to be on the losing team. So Riley did the one thing they didn't expect. He invited the local disability rights group to his house. Not for press, not for confrontation, just for documentation. 3 advocates came. 2 had wheelchairs. 1 brought a clipboard. They took photos, asked questions, and measured ramp angles. They logged everything. When they left, they shook his hand and told him quietly, "You're not alone. This isn't the first time, and we're not going to let it slide." By Sunday, Karen's flags had changed colors. Her yard was silent. Her dog was unseen. And for the first time in weeks, no car slowed down in front of Riley's home. But he didn't relax. He just reinforced the perimeter lights, topped off the van's gas tank, and sat on the porch with a cup of black coffee as the sun dipped below the line of houses. They hadn't broken him, but they had forced his hand. The next phase wouldn't be private, and it wouldn't be kind. The calm before it all came undone arrived not with silence, but with an eerie order. For nearly 3 days, nothing happened. No false complaints, no new flyers, no broken branches arranged near the driveway or dogs unleashed near Jade's ramp. The block, so recently pulsing with tension and whispered tactics, now moved with unnatural synchronization, as though someone had paused the neighborhood mid-breath. Riley didn't trust it. He had long ago learned that the absence of noise was rarely peace. It was recalibration. A lull not from retreat, but from coordination. Something was building, and everyone knew it, even if they wouldn't admit it to themselves. There was a particular kind of quiet in places where conflict hadn't disappeared, but merely gone underground, and Riley felt it in his chest like a barometric shift. Then the letter came. It was delivered in person by a courier. A young man in corporate gray with a tablet for a signature and an unreadable face. The envelope was thick, heavier than anything Riley had received since his mortgage papers, and bore the insignia of a private legal firm located 2 towns over. Inside was a formal cease and desist addressed to him by name and signed by the Neighborhood Oversight Committee, an entity that didn't legally exist but had somehow paid for legitimate counsel. The accusation was sweeping and cold. Persistent disturbance, emotional distress imposed upon local residents, unauthorized surveillance, malicious vehicular conduct, and psychological destabilization of community norms. It concluded with a demand: cease all retaliatory behaviors, remove all modifications to the property deemed non-standard, and attend a mandatory reconciliation session under penalty of civil filing. No signatures from neighbors, just the name of the firm and a date for a closed-door mediation. Tuesday, 9 a.m. Riley read it once. Then again. He didn't feel anger. He felt alignment. All the tactics, slow, psychological, detached, had finally been codified into what they really wanted: submission masked as civility. If he attended that mediation, he wouldn't be defending himself. He'd be participating in his own containment. They wanted a paper trail of compliance, a documented surrender. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he sat in the garage with the lights off and the door cracked just enough to watch the street. Around 2 a.m., a car rolled slowly past his driveway. Not a neighbor's car, no decals, no familiar profile. It paused just long enough for the dashboard camera to catch the plate. The next morning, he ran the plate through Victor's contact at the vehicle registry. It wasn't registered to anyone in the county. It belonged to a leasing company out of state, the kind that subcontracted to private investigation firms. Now, he understood what Tuesday really was. It wasn't just a meeting. It was a setup. If he walked in alone, if he said the wrong thing, it wouldn't just be a neighborly feud anymore. It would become an incident, a case file, possibly even grounds for a civil protection order. Once he was labeled, even implicitly, the rest of the resistance would collapse. They were building a frame around him, and all they needed was for him to step into it voluntarily. So he changed the terms. On Monday morning, Riley drove to the county recorder's office with his lawyer, where they filed a complaint for systemic harassment and targeted abuse under the Disability Rights Preservation Statute. The complaint named no individuals. It referenced only the pattern, the consequences, and the environment. It was not emotional, it was administrative, and it carried weight. At the same time, his lawyer sent a response to the mediation request, formally declining under state statute grounds, citing ongoing litigation and a pending civil protection review. No theatrics, no escalation, just process. Bureaucracy was slow, but it could be made to move in the right hands. By evening, his doorbell rang. It was Karen. She stood there with a folded brochure in her hand, wearing the face of someone trying to impersonate reason. Her tone was polished, but her eyes were stretched thin. She was losing the narrative, and she knew it. "I think we got off on the wrong foot," she began. Riley didn't invite her in. He didn't even lean on the doorframe. She handed him the brochure. It was about community restoration through conversation. Another thinly veiled appeal to submit. He didn't touch it. He let it drop to the porch floor. Karen hesitated. "I know you've been going through a lot. I know your daughter has needs. But we all have needs, Mr. Cole. This is a shared space. Compromise is how we live together." Riley looked her in the eye. "Compromise is when both sides give something up. So far, all I've given up is time, privacy, peace of mind, and my daughter's sense of safety." "What exactly have you compromised, Karen?" Her lips tightened. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "No." Riley said, his voice low and even. "You are." She left without another word. The next day, at 9 a.m., Riley didn't attend the meeting. Instead, a courier delivered a copy of the formal harassment complaint to the address listed on the cease and desist, delivered to the law firm, not Karen. He made sure the channel stayed clean. No direct accusations, just legally actionable structure. But Karen wasn't finished. That afternoon, Riley returned from picking up Jade to find 2 police cars parked outside his home. Officers were walking his property with a clipboard, measuring things. One of them approached asking for his license and registration, not because of a crime but because a report had been filed alleging that his van was being used for unauthorized transport of non-resident individuals. Jade was there, watching. Riley calmly handed over his documentation. When they tried to question Jade, he stepped between them and said clearly, "She's a minor. If you need anything, speak to my attorney." The officers exchanged a glance, muttered something into the radio, and left without further action. But the message was clear. If Karen couldn't break him through the neighborhood, she would try through the system. That night, he decided it was time to make his move. He didn't go to war. He called the media. But not the news. Not television. He contacted the state disability rights publication and offered them a private, quiet interview. Not about the drama, but about access, harassment, and the quiet war being waged in supposedly inclusive spaces. The journalist who came was young, sharp, and respectful. She spoke to Jade first, then Riley. No gotcha questions, just facts. 2 weeks later, the piece went live, not viral, but deep. State forums, legal groups, and advocacy boards picked it up. The names weren't listed, but everyone on the block knew exactly who it was about. Karen tried to play it down, telling her circle it was all fabricated, but no one believed her anymore. The final blow wasn't a fight. It was a letter, delivered by the county itself. An order for neighborhood review, citing systemic non-compliance with accessibility standards, launched as a result of Riley's complaint. The review would be public, binding, and include representatives from the State Office of Housing Equity. Karen disappeared from view after that. Her dog stopped barking. Her cart vanished from the driveway. She took down the flag she used to fly above her roses. By the time the inspectors arrived, her house was dark, windows shuttered. Riley didn't celebrate. He repainted the front step railings, reseeded the lawn, and replaced the cracked tiles on the porch. Jade began reading outside again. There was no parade, no dramatic confrontation, just the quiet return of space. And for the first time in months, when Riley looked out the window, he didn't see a battlefield. He saw home. The transformation of the neighborhood didn't come with announcements or apologies. No one knocked on Riley's door with baked goods or warm condolences. There were no reconciliation barbecues, no formal acknowledgments of wrongdoing, no letters of regret slipped under the door in trembling hands. What came instead was absence. Quiet, blank, and absolute. For weeks following the county's enforcement letter, Karen's house remained dark. The windows, once perfectly polished and trimmed with seasonal decor, were suddenly dull behind drawn curtains. Her lawn, once militantly edged and impossibly green, began to wither at the borders, the sprinklers misaligned, the flower beds unkept. There was no sighting of the blue golf cart, no shrill barking from the spoiled cocker spaniel, and no strategic patrols up and down the street with passive-aggressive nods. Karen Bliss had vanished without a word, and with her went the false order she had built. The neighborhood felt different, and not in a way Riley found comforting. For a time, it was as if the entire street had been sedated. People who once organized fake complaints and positioned trash bins with surgical hostility now walked their dogs without making eye contact. Lawn chairs were left inside. cars began to park in driveways again instead of lining the curb to box in Riley's van. It wasn't friendliness, but it was surrender, and in its own strange way, it was more honest than all the fake smiles and brittle pleasantries that had come before. Riley didn't take it as a victory. He didn't need it to be one. Victory wasn't in the defeat of Karen Bliss or the exposure of the committee's cowardly paper trail. Victory was that Jade began sleeping through the night again. In the mornings, she no longer lingered at the kitchen window, eyes scanning the sidewalk for signs of interference. She began wheeling herself out onto the porch again, sitting in the soft spring air with a sketch pad in her lap, her fingers trembling slightly from tension that hadn't yet fully left her body. Riley watched from the workbench, quietly resuming repairs on a hand-built guitar that had sat unfinished for months. They didn't talk about what had happened. They didn't have to. The silence between them now was no longer about fear. It was healing. The county review went forward as scheduled. Officials in reflective vests and badges visited the street, took measurements, reviewed the sidewalk grades and ramp inclines, and flagged multiple violations, many unrelated to Riley. Several neighbors received formal citations for inadequate curb access or non-compliant walkway obstructions. A few were forced to make adjustments, replace cracked paths, or remove decorative hedges that encroached on communal right-of-way. The irony didn't escape Riley, though he said nothing. There was no schadenfreude in watching people suffer mild inconvenience for systems they had once tried to weaponize. He had never wanted punishment. He had wanted space, respect, and quiet. Now he had all three. Karen's house was put up for sale 4 weeks after the review. No listing announcement, no open house, just a simple "for sale" sign, planted in the once pristine yard like a white flag in soil too tired to fight anymore. Rumors spread fast. Some said she had been forced out by mounting legal costs. Others claimed she'd left town entirely, moving to a place with fewer rules and less scrutiny. Riley didn't speculate. He just noted the silence and went back to watering the herbs Jade had replanted. When the moving truck finally arrived, midday, unmarked and professionally efficient, Riley stood behind his screen door and watched. No one came to help. No one gathered to wave goodbye. The truck was gone within 2 hours, the house left empty, its front gate swinging gently in the breeze. Later that evening, as the sky bruised to dusk, Riley took a walk around the block with Jade. It was the first time they had done so in months without a calculated route or rehearsed fallback plan. They passed Karen's house. Jade looked at it, then at Riley. "She's really gone." He nodded. Jade thought for a moment, then shrugged. "Okay," she said and rolled forward. Riley didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The months that followed weren't perfect, but they were real. Neighbors began nodding again, slowly, tentatively, as if afraid of overstepping. Some even offered quiet acknowledgments, not confessions, but gestures. One man from the opposite side of the street left a small potted plant at the base of the ramp with a tag that read, "Peace starts somewhere." Another, a woman Riley barely knew, apologized to Jade directly during one of her front yard reading sessions. "I didn't know how bad it got," she said softly. Jade nodded, not unkindly, and went back to her book. When summer rolled in, Riley hosted a cookout. Not for the block, just for Jade and 2 of her classmates from the therapy center, both of whom used wheelchairs. They played music, grilled burgers, and turned the driveway into a chalk mural of stars, dragons, and crooked houses. No one objected. A few neighbors watched from behind curtains, but none approached. Riley didn't invite them. It wasn't exclusion. It was clarity. Not everyone earns a seat at your table just because they stop throwing stones. In early September, Riley received an envelope in the mail from the local council. It was a survey, part of a pilot program on neighborhood equity and accessibility. A checkbox had been marked beside his name. consulted resident. He smiled slightly and filled it out, his responses honest, firm, and composed. At the bottom was a final question. Do you feel that your voice has been heard? Riley paused for a long moment before checking yes. He and Jade had earned their peace, not through retaliation, not through revenge, but by refusing to disappear. They had remained when others had tried to erase them. They had endured what was meant to drive them out. And in that endurance, they had reshaped the block, if not the people. Sometimes survival isn't the absence of pain. Sometimes it's the presence of conviction, stubborn, grounded, and quietly immovable. And for Riley, that was enough.